Hey guys, and welcome to this edition of Scruff's Garage. So today's project, I'm installing the rear shocks, front and rear shocks on the Corvette. I decided to spring for new shocks. If you saw my other video, I installed a set of the Z06 leaf springs. I have a base model coupe. The Z06 springs are stiffer spring rate, so I decided to get new shocks as well. These are Doug Rippie Motorsports valved Bilsteins, front and the rear. I also sprang just a few extra bucks. He offers a harder bushing, just a higher durometer bushing. The Bilsteins come with a rubber bushing that's a little softer. The harder ones just translate any suspension movement. Instead of the bushing absorbing the movement, it goes directly into the shock. So it just improves the responsiveness a little bit, but not a make it or break it kind of deal. The new Bilstein shocks also come with the plates that go above and below the bushings, and of course the new nylock nut as well. So they come a little baggy. So with the rear shocks, you've got this upper perch or shock plate, whatever you want to call it. So I just thought I'd show you how this gets assembled. Really straightforward. So basically, if I can get things oriented correctly, would go like this. So you see how this is indented, I guess you'd say, to fit that bushing. This has got kind of a notch in it that fits into the perch, and then this one's got an accompanying bushing, and it goes like that, and then it just slides onto the shock body like so. If you can see, so when you need to tighten this nut, obviously it's a nylock washer. The top of this has a hex, a 5mm hex in there. So you need to hold the shaft in place while you tighten the nut. So you would use hex like that, and then this is a 17mm nut to tighten this. You hold the shaft in place and then tighten the nut. You don't have to go crazy on this. I believe torque spec is like 19 foot-pounds. Though there's not really a good way to get a torque wrench on this, because you'd have to hold the shaft in place relative to the nut. Then obviously if you have a torque wrench over this, you have no way to get in there and hold the nut. So just get it good and snug, but 19 foot-pounds isn't anything crazy, so you don't have to crank down on that. But you don't want any slop in this either. Of course, the front shocks, you'll do the same thing, obviously, with the whatever bushings you're using. But of course, the frame upper shock perch would go in here, and then we'll do the same thing. Like I said, there's a new nut to go in there as well. So I'll show you how these get installed, and we'll get moving with the project. Here you go. When you start to see just a little bit of bulge in that bushing, you know you've got it tight enough. Okay, for installing the shock, obviously you've got your two upper shock mounting bolts. So get those started first, and then for the rear, for the lower, excuse me, if I can get this where you can see it. Obviously this needs to go here so that we can get said bolt started. Alright, so you may need to jack up with a floor jack under the lower control arm to get the bottom bolt lined up. So there we go. So got the lower bolt through, the nut on the other side. Perfect. Okay, so the next step will be get the upper and lower bolts torqued to spec. The rear uppers are 22 foot-pounds, which that's not very much. But this lower bolt, obviously it's a giant bolt here, it's 162 foot-pounds. So we'll really have to get out the breaker bar to make sure we can get to torque spec on that. But that's how the rear shock goes in. And of course, if you took the upper control arm loose for whatever reason, now would be the time to put that back into place. And of course, you've got the upper control arm mounting bolts, one from this side and one from this side. Once you get those in place, they get torqued to 81 foot-pounds. So make sure you don't forget about those. Okay, so now we're installing the front shocks. So I started with the suspension all the way down, full droop, and I got the lower shock bolts started. So the bolt comes up from the bottom, and then there's a nut, and then you can push the shock inward towards the upper mount, and then I needed to slowly jack up. Got a floor jack under the lower control arm, and I jacked it up. Make sure you go ahead and put your bushing and washer in there. Then you can jack up the lower control arm, which pushes the shock into the shock tower. And then up top, I don't know if you can see it, that's where the upper bushing, washer, and nut go. However, if you recall, to tighten the nut, we have to put the hex into the shock body shaft, and that's very difficult with such little room up there. So probably the easiest thing to do is to move the reservoir tank. So you've got two mounting bolts, one there, one there, and then I don't know if you can see in there very well. Sorry about that. Right there, there's one more bolt. Really, you only have to loosen that, because if you see right there, it's just a slotted tab, so that will slide in there. You just have to loosen that. Those are but 3 10 millimeter bolts, and then get that where you can see it. Now we can get to the top of the shock. We can get a hex in there to hold that while we tighten the nut. And again, we don't have to tighten that crazy tight, but we do need to get it snug. Like I said, about 19 foot-pounds, I think is the spec. Again, I don't know how you get a torque wrench on there to verify that, but just get it snug. If you see the bushing just starting to bulge just a little bit, then you know you got it pretty snug. And then, of course, the lower shock bolts, front lower, they're 21 foot-pounds. Not a lot, but make sure we get those tight as well. And then we'll be able to lift up on the suspension, and I can put the upper control arms back in place and get those tightened. The front upper control arm bolts get tightened to 48 foot-pounds. Okay, so we're on the driver's side to install the front shock. I went ahead and twisted the lower dog bone, or this lower pass-through bolt, whatever you want to call that. Put it at a little bit of an angle so it matches the angle of the lower control arm. Make it a little bit easier to get things lined up. And now I'm going to get a floor jack and lift up on the lower control arm so we can seat this in here, and then I'll have enough thread up here that I can put the washer and the bushing in. I did have to move the washer fluid tank over here on the driver's side to get access to the top of the shock bolt to get a hex in there. But there's a mounting bolt right there, and a mounting bolt right there. Electrical connector. It's a grounding point. Sits on there. So just get those loose, and then you can kind of move this to the side and get a little better access. Okay, there we go. So that's the finished product. Got the shock absorber installed. Got the upper control arm bolted to the frame rails. Got the upper shock nut tight. Got the lower shock bolts tightened as well. Everything's to torque spec. Of course, I still have to put the brake caliper back on. But that gives you the gist of how the shocks are installed. If you got any questions, be sure to hit me up in the comments below. I'll help any way that I can. And once I get some miles on the car, I'll be happy to give a review on the Doug Rippie shocks as well. I've read great things about them, so I'm excited to give them a try. As always, I ask that you like and subscribe to the videos. It helps me keep making more videos and lets me know that you're enjoying them. So, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.